the most important thing to remember about United Way is we never do it alone, right? So there are over 60 programs that we fund, and many of the actual agencies might be here local in the Ann Arbor Ipsy area, but they still work with families, in
Yep.
Manchester or in other places. Um, so just really listening to what people needed and then making sure we delivered on what they needed was critical. And because we did it with such an equity focus, we were able to leverage our largest state grant that we ever received. We were able to get a $500,000 grant from the Racial Diversity Task Force, recognizing the work that we were doing, with the different programs and initiatives in our community was really making a difference. So that's the beauty of collaboration and community impact.
So, do you think that this is a trend in philanthropy more broadly, that some of these things are starting to be understood? I know, like with the Mackenzie Scott gifts that have been happening, in the last couple of years, that's a radically different approach to philanthropy than what we've typically seen.
Yeah.
And it seems to embrace some of these same principles. But on the other hand, there are cultural traditions around philanthropy that seem to run counter to this whole idea as well. Um, without asking you to speak to any specifics of the that you work in that might be sensitive. What are your sort of perceptions on that broadly in terms of how philanthropy as a idea in this country, or in this area? And I want to ask you later a little bit about this area specifically because I think it's a really interesting example.
Yeah.
But yeah, how do you see that? Do you think that this is something that's happening more broadly?
I think that philanthropy is evolving and I think it's going to continue to change. Um, so if you compare, right? So if you compare, especially through a lot of our different equity work that we've done, is so much of this country was born on the backs of people of color, specifically Black people of color. And so many processes, structures, and procedures were in place to make sure they weren't able to own land, to make sure they weren't able to accumulate wealth, to always be under the management of someone else instead of having the true freedom that they really deserved. And so in the past, we almost have kind of like a savior mentality, right? People are poor. I'm going to give you bread for today, right? Instead of the old adage of teaching people to fish and giving them resources so they can become independent. And I think what we're moving to today is understanding. So there is a kind of philanthropy called community-centric fundraising, and it changes from catering to the donor to catering to the community and always putting people first. And I think United Way has done that very well for a long time. But we are really doubling down. We have a strategic plan that we're currently building through 2025, and we're really taking a harder look at community centric fundraising. And it's a new concept in philanthropy. So I do think change is going to happen.
Does that present any challenges with the donor relationship end? Because, a big part of traditional fundraising is, starting with donor intent and kind of working with what they want to do. Um,
Exactly.
but I guess this evolution of thinking needs to happen with the donors as well.
Yeah. And one of the things that we have been doing for about the last 4 years, we began holding equity challenges, 21-day equity challenges. I think you've heard about them. I think you and I
Yes.
have
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
talked about them. So
Yeah.
for those students and your listeners that don't know what that is, it was originally started. Two Harvard professors worked with Food Solutions Network on the East Coast around the Boston area, and it was a way for people to be able to engage and learn more about all things regarding equity. And gosh darn it, if I don't appreciate them for making it all open source, because
Oh
they
yeah.
were, I came across it and I took it. And 21 Day Equity Challenge is free, anonymous, private. And each day for 21 days, you get a topic in your inbox, in your email. And in that in that topic, there's all different kinds of ways for you to continue learning. Um, and it talks about all different kinds of things. It talks about different levels of racism. It talks about becoming an ally. It talks about segregation. Um, it talks about the LGBTQ plus community. It talks about AAPI communities, BIPOC communities, um, and and things like privilege and white fragility and implicit bias. And so the reason when I came across it, I thought it was so important to bring here is because I've been talking about poverty in our community for years. And we had commissioned the ALICE report, which is asset limited, income constrained, but employed, essentially the working poor.
Hmm.
And I had so much pushback in Washtenaw County that there wasn't poverty here and that Ann Arbor was the best place in the world to look. Just look, we're on all of these lists, right?
Right.
So much so, Jeff, that I bought billboards on 23 and 94 that just said poverty here question mark yes.
I remember those. Yeah.
Yeah, right? Just because and so what I found is that people, we might begin the conversation, but if we used terminology or words or conversations where people didn't know what they were, then they just shut down and they stopped talking about it. So the equity challenge for me gave people a way to do it in the comfort of their own, you know, desk, coffee shop, wherever they opened up their laptop for that day. And then they could watch a video, they could read a white paper, they could have a call to action through an advocacy thing, they could go to a community event. But we just started peppering them with all the different ways they could learn and they could choose, you know, like, oh, I can only spend 5 minutes on it today, but I'm walking away knowing more about what white fragility is. And the next time I hear it, at a restaurant or at my work or at book club or at the PTO, I'm going to at least know that definition and be more comfortable learning more about it. So that's really what we were just trying to do is get people like an on-ramp to the expressway, right?
Hmm.
To get on and to be committed to talking about it and recognizing its existence. And so the first one that we did went viral. Um, it went across the country. I had people calling from California and Texas and saying, hey, you know, I know a lot of like what we did is we took the basic framework from Food Solutions Network and we completely localized it for here. So all of the data was about us in Washtenaw County. And I was like, sure, take whatever you want, because a lot of it was general enough, right? I can't change the definition of implicit bias, or I can't, you know, like
Right.
I'm not going to change a TED talk or anything like that. But I could give people data about the poverty rates here. I could give people data about the social determinants of health here, you know, like, and people could do that in their own. So long story short, because I know we don't have forever, I do get
No, go ahead. I don't mind. I like the details.
So we made sure it was open source. We returned all of the learning to our network. And I'm just really proud to say that over 65 United Ways have done equity challenges, not only across the nation, but in 2 countries abroad. And we've had over 300,000 people participate in an equity challenge.
Wow.
And that to me is just it's kind of just like what students do at Optimize is they have a good idea and they build on that good idea until it becomes actionable. It changes a community somewhere. A community can be 2 people, but it's changing a community, and then it takes off, right, and gets bigger. And that's what was so exciting to me when you first talked to me about what your ideas were and how to capitalize on putting theory into practice. And what
Hmm.
you were learning in the classroom, you needed to be able to put into practice into a community. And it really, that's when the real learning takes place. That's really
Yeah.
when the really, like, we talk a lot about in the nonprofit world, in education specifically, that children are learning to read until 3rd grade, and then they begun reading to learn, right? So
Mm.
there's a definite change. And that's what happens with optimized students. You know, they're in the classrooms, they're learning about the theory of social justice and social change, but optimized gives them the ability to put theory into practice and make things happen. And when you begin to see the cause and effect of action, that's so powerful. Um, so,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like, just to stick with the equity challenge for a second,
mm,
I like
mhm,
that it's something that people, like you said, can do in their own space, in their own time, and not feel like they're being put under a tremendous amount of pressure to be at a certain place at a certain time. Um, I think a lot of these issues that are part of the equity challenge have become very controversial, in our society.
mhm.
Partly, though, because the way that they've been presented sometimes is through, like, corporate seminars where you're there and your boss is there, and there's, this
Yeah,
hugely pressurized environment to
yeah,
feel like I really can't learn because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing and being, sort of like suffering consequences of that.
yeah,
And I think that that is a hard environment to learn in. And, this environment where you're in your own space and it's giving you an on ramp, like you said, to understanding concepts that are not easy to understand sometimes, depending on your perspective, and might challenge your current thinking. That kind of an environment, in my view, is a more conducive environment to learning than some of the kinds of contexts that have become very controversial. And I
mhm,
think that they've become controversial not necessarily because of the subject matter alone, but because of the way it's been presented in certain cases. Um,
yeah. I mean, being a middle-aged white woman, I have had questions about why are you doing this, right?
hmm,
And I think it's a great question. And I am always the first to admit I am not an expert, right? And I am a continual learner and I rely on all of the great information that's out there. I just want to be a conduit, right? I'm in a position where I can share information, and that's what I'm trying to do. Um, and I think that that's what's so important to remember is that every single person has or can have that opportunity to be a conduit for conversation